So a topic that is a favorite among many of us, sex. That's what we're going to talk about today. I thought this would be good based on a conversation that we had a couple weeks ago. The conversation afterward turned to just how do we talk about sex in our culture? What misconceptions do we have about it? How do we talk about rape culture? How do you talk to kids about sex? So I thought it would just be a good topic for us to discuss, and especially as a kind of a follow-on to the Pride in the Park Week event that we had. A lot of people have very specific conceptions about sex and gender and sexuality that they maybe have not considered, that they hold these things, that they have these biases or whatever it happens to be. So I wanted to address this topic, and it's actually going to be a two-part series. So today we're going to talk about some of the more cultural ideas related to sex and sexuality, and then next week we're going to talk a little bit more on the interpersonal level, healthy sexual relationships, how specifically do you talk to kids about sex, and then whatever other topics we want to discuss, both today and next week. So why is this important to us, right? So other than, it's one of the drivers, right, of human activity, right? We pursue sex. It's kind of built into us. And then obviously affects how we interact in society, right? So that's a big reason to do it. Another one is related to power, right? There's a lot of power related to sex and how we contrive the ideas about sex. And so I think if we hold it out in front of us and examine it a little bit, it would be helpful to us as a society to break down some of the things that are maladaptive in today's world that maybe we've carried over from a world that was very different from today. So obviously sex is complicated. And I think that people oftentimes want to make it more simple. And that's understandable. As humans, we want to make things simple, right? We make heuristic leaps. We categorize things into sort of quick and dirty categories so that we can quickly conceptualize them and deal with whatever information is out there. But in doing so, we miss a lot of nuance. We miss a lot of detailed data that provides value on a particular topic. So sex has many dimensions. So physical, emotional, then you've got the familial dimensions, cultural, and then the effects on society at large. So this is not just one thing or a couple of things. It spans all of human existence and how we interact with each other. And it also affects how we perceive the world and how we perceive other humans. Right? As I look around the room, my brain categorizes people into male and female because that's how my brain is trained. Right? That's all the images I see on TV and throughout media throughout my life. Right? That's just how I perceive the world. But I know from research that that is not the case. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. So what framework then, right? We talk a lot about framework in our church and our organization. What frameworks are useful to us in making humanity better? So what frameworks would be useful for us to think about sex to then be better humans? And then what do we get out of the better relationships that we might build from this framework? And going back to sort of our core way that we want to develop, we would have better relationships as individuals, better relationships as a community, and then better relationships as a society or as humanity. So first thing is sex. So this is just kind of background science. There's a really good TED Talk on how we think about sex, and I'm talking about biological sex in this case. And we often think of it, again, as male and female. And that's based almost solely of our idea of external genitalia, right, and external characteristics. So Emily Quinn gives a great talk about how we do this wrong or how we do this badly. And she says, besides your genitalia, you also have chromosomes, gonads, like ovaries and testicles. You have your internal sex organs, your hormone production, your hormone response, and then your secondary sex characteristics like breast development, body hair, etc. So there are 7 areas of biological sex that all have variation, not just the one. And yet, out of that, we have only derived 2 options, male and female, right, as the norm or normal. The thing I thought was really interesting about examining that variation is that everything in nature has variation. Nothing is just one thing, right? Nothing is an exact copy of something else. Think about plants or trees. You might say that's an oak tree, right? But oak trees don't all look the same, but we all characterize them as oak trees because we're humans and we put names to things, right? The leaves are shaped different. We went for a nature hike yesterday and saw many variations on poison ivy, right? How the leaves were shaped, what they look like, etc. So when it comes to humans, why would it be any different that there's variety? Or that there isn't variety? Why is it that we would say there are only two things and they would be in these perfect forms? Right? And she gave, interesting examples of think about your sexual encounters in your life and think about what even the external genitalia looked like for those partners. And then she was like, go ahead, imagine it. I won't judge. Right? And I know you're doing it right now because I said imagine it, right? And did they all look the same? No. There's not one template, one form that even those things come in. So which one of those is then the ideal or the norm? Right? There isn't one. There's simply a variation, a bell curve, oftentimes. So I think we need to start from this and back up and say, all right, let's do the best we can to wipe away our preconceived notions just of physical sex. To then say, all right, there's already variation. There's variation in the number of chromosomes. There's variation in the expression of hormones and how they develop the internal, external sex organs. Now, some people might say, well, the things that aren't quote-unquote normal are then deviations, right? Deviation is the same root word as deviant, which means wrong, right? Doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, there's just variation, right? Throughout the development of all of the species on the planet, we've evolved and we've mutated and we've changed. And those changes are either adaptive or maladaptive for particular times and circumstances in history. So I think we need to consider how are things adaptive or maladaptive in our society and how can they be useful? And this goes back to the idea of optionality, maintaining the options that we have as a species. As we go into space, is it possible that people who are asexual may be beneficial to helping to pilot a spaceship, for instance? Maybe they are the perfect recruit for that particular job. And if we count them as deviant or different or bad, how are we missing out on an opportunity? Now, that's just an example that I came up with on the fly, right? But how are different people valuable in different ways? I think that's something important to examine. And then there's gender, right? So if biological sex is variable, just based on the biological expression, what then does gender mean? What does it mean to be male or female, to be masculine or feminine? Right? Those are mostly cultural conceptions. And if you've never been outside of your culture, you have no idea the variety that exists just today before we even start to reconsider some of what we would consider our foundational ideas. Right? So just think about stereotypes, domestic versus risk-taking, right? Stereotypically, we put women in the domestic category, right? They're better communicators, they're better multitaskers, they're better at tolerating children, et cetera, right?
Washing dishes.
Right, washing dishes, yeah. Barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, et cetera, right? So what about men being risk takers, right? We value that. Look at all of our media, right? Men are risk takers, they're aggressive, they're physical. But those are just the stereotypes. And what's interesting is as we have grown our ability to produce media, a lot of times those stereotypes are reinforced. Now, there's the option, right, if people go and look for it, for things that are different. So there's a lot of access to different viewpoints, but you have to seek them, especially if you're trapped inside of your little bubble. It would require your effort to go outside of your bubble to find something that is different and then match it up to what you see. So for instance, I've been called androgynous before. People also thought I was gay for a couple of years, and that was based on stereotypes, not behaviors or anything else, and there's nothing wrong with it. I actually thought it was a great compliment, right? Because the gay people that I know tended to be well-dressed, articulate, intelligent. They were also, skilled in the arts, song and dance, which I like to do. I love to cook. I'm a relatively clean guy. So to me, that was a terrific compliment. But that's because I didn't adhere to a particular stereotype, right? I looked a little bit different. I acted a little bit differently. I didn't go along with the crowd for a lot of things. So does that make me more or less valuable? Well, I think my wife finds it valuable because she loves my cooking, right? That's why she married me in the first place. Right? But this is how we build the idea of gender in our minds based on what we see, right? When we're growing up, what toys we should be playing with, right? So this morning, I was looking at my daughter, who's 5. She cut off all of her hair. I don't know why exactly. I think it was just bothering her, and she cut it off. Because she has no notion of short hair and long hair, right? She started to experience that because some kids have commented on her hair or assumed she was a boy based on their experiences. Not out of malice, just out of what they normally see. And then today she was wearing what would appear to be a boy's shirt. She just thought it was a good shirt for her, and she is wearing it. So from a distance, she probably looks like a boy. Again, not a big deal, but some people might say, oh, that's a boy's shirt, you can't wear that. And then she's going to start to think about, well, why? Or that's wrong, right? And that might limit her expression as she goes forward. Now, if she chooses to continue to dress and act in a way that people might perceive as boyish, she's likely going to encounter some sort of resistance or some sort of discrimination or some sort of teasing, right? Now, between my wife and I, we don't care, but we're going to help explain to her, like, hey, some people don't understand because you look a little bit different. That's okay, but also realize that it's going to be reality, right? And so I think this is where we can start to have this conversation about what these things mean. Again, within our little family unit, and then as we go out and other people question, well, why does she dress like that? Well, because she wants to, and she has clothes on, so she's not doing anything illegal, so why should it matter? Right? And that's going to challenge other people's notions of what it means to be male or female, or dress or act a certain way.
I want to ask you a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Something in there, it's kind of a dichotomy of male and female. Do you think people should, at some point in their life, make a stand, either one side or the other?
Like where they end up?
Whether they formulate that in their mind as a teenager or young adult, or some people even into their old age, they might
Switch.
change their mind.
Yeah. So for those who are.
Is it important to make a decision and try to go with it, or should you just be kind of open-ended through your whole life, kind of a buy?
Well, so there's a difference. So I get your question. There's, I think, a difference between gender expression and then sexual orientation, right? So what you're interested in sexually. So the question was, for those at home, should you take a stand at some point and sort of choose one? The question I always come back to in examining some principle is it useful, right? Is it useful to do one of those things? Well, it could be in your circumstance, or it might not be, right? So some people, and throughout history this has been true, that people have taken a stance and then acted and dressed a certain way because they found it to be advantageous for themselves. Either it resolved some sort of internal conflict, or it resolved some sort of external conflict where they were facing discrimination or threatening, behaviors from other people. So the question is always based on the individual. Is it going to be useful for you to take a stand? Now, might it cause distress for others if you choose to switch throughout life? One of the examples from the TED Talk that I mentioned is that some people didn't find out they were intersex, and in this case that means that they had some sort of different biological expression of one of those traits than the quote-unquote male and female. So they didn't find out they were XXY until they were in their 40s, right? Or they didn't find out that they had internal testicles, basically, internal gonads of the male chromosome, but they expressed totally as female, with female genitalia, etc. So a lot of times people don't know, so that makes it hard then to say, should we take a stand or not take a stand?
Hormone deficiency.
Right, so there are so many variations in those things, it's hard to say that we should do a thing. But I think we should ask ourselves, when we're looking at it through a framework, is it beneficial to us to express in one way or another? I think that's more the foundational question. And so the framework of the binary male and female, maybe that was a useful framework in the hunter-gatherer days. Maybe it was easier for people to think about it in that way. I don't know why, because I wasn't alive 50,000 years ago, right? But maybe that was something that was useful. It was useful to categorize people into, all right, there are two jobs. One is to go out and find and kill food, and the other is to gather and develop the family. Those were the only two jobs available, right? And so maybe that was useful at the time. But even from the evolutionary sense, there are some theories out there that having people that are not binary actually help kind of the greater gene pool flourish. So there's an interesting group of people called the Fa'afafine in Samoan culture. And they're basically transgender uncles, so they identify as female, but they're biologically male, and they have sort of a clear role in the society where they help to care for the nieces and nephews. And if you think about it from sort of the gene pool perspective, so if they're, the brother, right, to the children, their Y chromosome then passes through those children, so it actually helps to preserve the Y chromosome line, even though they're not going to have offspring of their own. And so I saw the other day where two male bald eagles were helping to care for one egg. So non-binary gender expression actually occurs even in other species. So it's interesting that variation exists throughout, so the animal kingdom and throughout nature, and may have an actual benefit when it comes to passing down genes, right, and ensuring the survival of certain species.
They say something like seahorses can change.
Right. Yeah, so there are many actual species out there that can actually change gender based on environmental factors, which is, yep, fish, frogs, right? If you've seen Jurassic Park, right? So I think this gets into this idea of categorization, right? Humans love to categorize things. The world is detailed and nuanced and confusing, so it's easier for us to put things into chunks, and we do it rapidly, and that causes us to have bias. Now, so on the good side, chunking things is a faster processing mechanism, right? Think about numbers, memorizing numbers. It's very clear that chunking numbers into small segments helps us remember things, right? And so when we see things, particularly in the world, we're usually detecting threat and non-threat. And so if we put things in a threat category, we're watching out for those things. Now, we're programmed today to see things as threats that maybe aren't, or to see them as threatening wrongly. So that means that the bad side of that is we have biases and stereotypes. Today, that means that we need to counter-program ourselves against those biases, right? We have to examine the idea that we automatically put things in chunks, right? We do that. We just have to accept that. And then say, now that I've put things in chunks, which of those things is not useful to me in greater society? So I think gender, first, sex, biological sex, male and female, isn't even true, right? There's a clear distribution beyond 1 and 2. And then gender expression then again is more nuanced, and I think again is not useful. Now we're going to do it for decades still, even if we start to transition our mindset now because of the lingering effects, the latent ideas that exist in society. But I think it's something that helps us to move forward. So one of the reasons that categorization is a problem is because a lot of times we categorize things into right and wrong, normal and not normal. And those categorizations particularly are about power, right? Certain structures that exist within our society benefit from the idea of a binary, a clear right and wrong, right? A black and white, a good and bad. So we have to ask ourselves, one of the rules of critical thinking is to ask, who benefits from this? Who benefits from the idea of good and bad and putting certain things in the good category and certain things in the bad category? right? How are they exerting control and power through the framework that they're propagating? So I'm not here to name names or point fingers, but I think that's something that we need to ask ourselves to say, who benefits? Why are things the way they are? And what might change if we change those frameworks? So one of the things when it comes, so again, back to gender, or I'm sorry, not gender, but sexual interest, right? So this gets to your other question. So the Kinsey scale. All right, some of you may be familiar with the Kinsey scale and the studies that he and his colleagues did about sexuality. And they determined that there's a huge variance when it comes to sexual expression. Now, the way that scale was derived was not from a test. It wasn't from what are you interested in. It was based purely on history. What have your experiences been? Have you engaged in heterosexual behavior, homosexual behavior, or no sexual behavior at all? And then people were placed on that scale based purely on their history. So there are a lot of tests out there that say we can predict your Kinsey score, but that's not actually how it was built. You can go to the actual Kinsey website and read about this. But it showed that there's a huge variation in how people orient themselves sexually, what they're interested in. So now we have biological sex, gender expression, how you appear and how you present yourself, and then sexual orientation, which is how what you're interested in, how you express yourself sexually to other people. So that's 3 factors, and of course the first one has 7 factors in there. So when you do the do the math on how many options are out there, it's a lot, and it's more than 2. So that's my public math for the day. A lot and more than 2. And then we have ideas like asexuality, people who are not interested in sex, and that could be for a number of reasons. It could be cultural, it could be how they grew up, it could be their hormonal expression, right? And then there is the alphabet soup of LGBTQIA, and I think there are other ones out there, plus, right? When we are interfacing with people in the world, we want to make it simple, right? But I think the easiest way to make it simple is instead of saying how many options are there, is to talk about there's one option, and that's human, right? We're all human. We're all variants of human. Just like if we found a flower, there are variants of that flower in the color and the shape, etc. So if I'm human and you're human, I think we should be able to get along with that. So instead of annotating the differences, doesn't mean we discount them, but instead of saying, I need to know exactly how to categorize you, I think we should maybe take a step back and say, I'm human, you're human, we're good to go. So now I want to talk a little bit about the sort of the functioning of sexual activity, so brain activity and sex. So it's a powerful thing, right? Sex generally produces oxytocin in the minds of the people engaging in it, and that's also known as sort of the bonding hormone, right? Children generate it, and it's the baby smell, right? It's associated with the baby smell. It produces oxytocin in your mind. It helps you to bond with your child. So engaging in sex with someone else helps to bond those people chemically, right? When they talk about, do you have chemistry? It's actually chemistry. The pheromones and the scents and the things that are produced in your mind, they're actually chemicals. It also offsets cortisol, which is stress, right? This is a stress hormone. So having sex both makes you feel good and helps you decrease stress. So go have sex today, right? It's your public service announcement. What's interesting is it actually stimulates a specific region in the mind that is also stimulated by music and dance. Sort of the rhythmic, trance-like state that your mind goes into. So I thought that was a curious thing. So there's a few links that I'll put out on the Facebook afterwards so you guys can read some of these articles and look at some of the research. But that also means that it can be abused, right? Just like any other chemical dependency. So sex is neither good nor bad. Well, it's good in terms of propagating the species, so that's a clear one. But its use, particularly in the cultural context, is neither good nor bad and should be considered as an activity, right? And anything taken to extremes can be detrimental. And I don't mean in terms of what you're interested in, because to me that's almost irrelevant. But there are things to consider as we think about sex as an activity. So one of those is addiction, right? So your brain produces chemicals when you engage in certain activities. Addiction is generally defined as something that is detrimental to your overall life and health that you do compulsively, right? So that's not to say that anyone who engages in sex is going to fall into addiction, but it's something that we should consider in terms of a brain function, that it's a possibility. And that's true when it comes to overstimulation and desensitization, right? So there's research out there related to pornography. To me, pornography, again, is neither good nor bad. It can be both an artistic expression of human sexuality, or it can be a degrading medium that trains people to have unrealistic expectations. But it depends on how it's used. If you've seen the movie Don John with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, it talks about the harmful things that pornography can do in programming your brain to either expect a certain thing or to require pornography to get stimulated with a partner. Now again, that's neither good nor bad. It depends on the proclivity of the relationship. But it's important to think of how are the things that we use in terms of our relationships affecting our brain chemistry. Because a lot of times we ignore it. We just think things are the way they are. We think, oh, we have chemistry or we don't. Or things should or should not operate in a certain way. But I think we need to be a little bit more mindful of our minds. Mindful of how things hack our minds to react in certain ways. How do we want to control our expression to be most beneficial to us?
I was thinking chemical reactions. Some chemical reactions create chaos.
Right. And so chemical reactions differ in different people, right? So there are people for whom, and I think it's linked in this article, for whom sex actually creates a negative feeling, right? And so based on the individual, we have to consider, how does this affect us? And then there's association, right? So some people associate sex with things that are good, and some people associate sex with things that are bad, right? How does our history affect that? How does our cultural experience affect that? How much guilt is associated with sex based on our upbringing, right? These are things that we have to consider and maybe sometimes reprogram for ourselves to say, how can I make this more beneficial for myself? And of course, your brain can be reprogrammed. There's a lot of science out there that shows that, whether it's through building new habits or associating things differently. Sex is a powerful reprogrammer because it affects a lot of chemicals kind of simultaneously. So it does have the ability to reprogram your mind and the associations that you have with certain things. And then, of course, just on the physical level, there are STDs, right? And we'll get into, in just a second, explaining why we have such a hard time with STDs, but that's something to consider in engaging in activity. There are risks with everything that we do. So one of the reasons that I think STDs are particularly problematic is because of our inability to talk about sex culturally, right? We have this idea that people who have STDs are bad people, right? That they're the deviants, they're the people who have done the wrong thing, right? And that's been programmed into us culturally. Instead of simply having conversations about the realities of STDs, right? It's estimated that somewhere around 80% of the population in the US has type 1 herpes, right? Which tends to be the type that manifests orally. 80%, right? So of the people in this room, let's call it 10, 8 of you have herpes. Congratulations, right? Now, that's a generalization, of course. But think about that. We have such a stigma with that, and 80% of people have it. That's like 80% of people being right-handed, right? But the other, and then saying the right-handed people are bad, right? I'm not sure about the number, but.
Blurb that said Coachella was spreading herpes.
I saw that, yeah.
So demonize the.
But so instead, if we didn't demonize sexuality and having sex, we might be more comfortable having a conversation, be like, hey, when's the last time you've been tested? And just having it be more of a casual conversation. Instead of it being this really weird and awkward thing that attacks you personally, because it does right now. If you ask someone if they've been tested, they're almost instantly and mortally offended, because what you're saying to them is that you look like an unclean person, right? And that they assume that you're attacking their personal identity, which in their mind you are, because you've been programmed to think that good people don't have STDs and bad people do. So I think that's something to consider in terms of, Kelly, yeah.
The more current expression is STIs, sexually transmitted infections. Because infections can be treated, where
Right.
diseases, you think of a disease as something...
It's incurable, yeah.
Yeah, that's cancer or something. So the doctors are using
Sexually transmitted infections.
Infection because infections can be treated. And
Right.
most STIs can be cured.
Right,
Not
yeah.
all.
Most sexually transmitted issues are curable, either through antibiotics or treatments. There are some that aren't, that of course then turn into diseases. So, but that is a good point, that there's so much stigma associated with it, even in the terminology, that we have to consider and think about reprogramming. So, how do we change this, or what other factors kind of play into this? So one is inaccurate expectations and then senses of entitlement, right? So we have these ideas surrounding sex, that we're going to find a partner, they're going to be a quote-unquote clean partner, and things are just going to happen, right? It's just going to be magic, right? We're just going to be in a relationship and we're just going to know. This one is one of my favorites when it comes to talking about consent. So I've taught a lot of sexual assault prevention courses over my time, and people have this idea about consent that you'll just, we'll know, right? Well, how will you know? Well, they'll give me the look, right? It's like, all right, well, define the look. Well, they're going to, X, Y, and Z. It's like, that seems pretty vague to me, that you're just going to engage in a physically intimate behavior based on a look. But that's what our culture tells us, right? It's the expectation that is set for us, that we don't have to communicate clearly. We're just going to know everything's going to be fine. And yet we know that everything is not fine in not a statistically, like the prevalent, like all the time, but a large number of cases, people end up in situations where they didn't agree to something and it happened anyway. Why did this happen? Why did this happen? People didn't feel empowered to say no. People did say no, and the other party thought, well, no means yes. So how do we start to have this conversation? So what I shared, I was doing a training, and there was a young man who was having a hard time role-playing asking for consent. And so I basically sat in, I excused him from his spot, I sat in, and it's as simple as saying, hey, would you like to have sex right now? Now, to many of you, that seems exceptionally blunt. Now, granted, you would be in a circumstance where you're close to someone, maybe you're cuddling on the couch together, maybe you're watching a movie, right? That was the code word back in college, or you want to come over and watch a movie. And so there's contextual clues there. And this is what I would tell them, right? So after that, first of all, after they said, no, you can't do that, you'd ruin the mood, right? That's not realistic. And I say, no, it is realistic. I've done it. And let me explain to you what it communicates other than what I'm saying. So if I ask the question, do you want to have sex right now? There are only two possible answers, yes and no, for right now. So in the case that the answer is yes, the other person has likely already made up their mind if they want to have sex with you or not. And in asking the question, you have communicated them the respect that they deserve as another human being to ask for consent. So you've telegraphed your respect. If the answer is no, then in asking the question, you have respected their boundaries, and maybe you have an opportunity at a later time. And you've communicated clearly so that there are no misunderstandings and no bad outcomes. Yes, rejection hurts a little bit, but it's better than sexually assaulting someone, I personally think. So it's that simple. It sounds crazy, right? Some people might think that just sounds absurd because in the movies there's always the look and the lean and the kiss and then they're rolling in the bed together. It's just not a realistic way to engage as human beings. Communication is hard enough as it is, and to layer on assumptions, right, and an implied communication is just way too complicated. Just ask the question. So going back to our cultural expectations, we need to start to talk about that. We need to start to clarify the expectations, right? We've seen a lot in the media where people who have gone on to commit mass shootings talk a lot about the expectations they had around women and sex. These are generally men, right? And how they have expected women to respond to them and they didn't. One of the things I'd like to challenge people with, particularly young men, is that if you need some sort of drug, and alcohol is a drug, by the way, to get someone to have sex with you, that makes you a coward. Now, that's not to say you can't go out and have a couple of drinks with folks, but if you're getting someone drunk to have sex with them, that means that you are so afraid of rejection that you would rather take away their choice than be rejected. To me, that's cowardice. So we need to put that expectation out there for young men and young women to say, you need to be asking each other these questions. And you need to be, if you're not desirable to women or to the gender that you're interested in, maybe there's something wrong with the way you're presenting yourself. As in, maybe you're an asshole. So it might just be a simple truth that you have to face. You might have to look in the mirror and be like, am I an asshole? Am I a slob? Am I doing nothing with my life that makes me appealing to someone, who I think might want to have sex with me? Maybe. I think we have to realize that it's on us to make choices that affect how we interact with people in the world, right? I learned to cook, right? I learned to cook because I like to eat, but it also had the secondary effect of being appealing to women. So that's a win-win for me, right? What is it that we are doing to make ourselves appealing when maybe people haven't been interested in us for a while? What are our motivations in life? And sex is not the end-all be-all of life. It just isn't. It is really nice. It's a great activity. It's good for the heart, right? In two ways. But those are the things that we need to talk about culturally. And we don't, right? Why is this? A lot of it's cultural. A lot of it stems from religion. A lot of it stems from cultural upbringing. I won't get into the specifics of who, how, and why, but it's there, right? Americans are not as comfortable talking about sex as other cultures, right? I've been to Europe. I have seen a muffler ad that had a topless woman in a newspaper. I don't know what it had to do with the mufflers, but it did catch my attention, so maybe it was effective advertising. I don't know. But it was just not a big deal, which I found interesting. What are some other cultural aspects? One is victim blaming, right? Just like with STDs and STIs, right? We blame people for the bad things that happen to them because we want to make them different from ourselves. If we say, they're a bad person, therefore this happened to them, that keeps us safe in our mind. Because I'm a good person, I do the right things, therefore I will not suffer these bad consequences. There was a rape case that I was made privy to through a former prosecuting attorney, and I won't get into the specifics of who it was and where, but what happened was a young woman was abducted from the street at 9 o'clock at night, taken out to a field, dragged through a barbed wire fence, raped, drugged back through the barbed wire fence, dropped back off in the town. They had DNA evidence, they had the vehicle, they had blood and bodily fluids, both from the crime scene, the barbed wire, the woman, the perpetrator. Seems like a slam dunk case, right? So it goes to trial, and the perpetrator ended up getting off because the jury could not come to a unanimous decision. And do you know why?
Was the woman wearing a miniskirt?
The woman was not wearing a miniskirt, but you're on the right track. They were wondering why she was out at night by herself. That was the question they could not resolve, And therefore, they were blaming her for being by herself at night, for getting raped. And so which stereotypical gender was the hardest on her?
Women.
The women. For that exact reason I mentioned earlier. Because they have done all the right things, all the things they've been taught, right? Walk in well-lit areas, always have a friend with you, carry your keys as Wolverine claws, right? Which puts all of the responsibility on the victim. Who is the only person who can stop a crime?
The criminal.
The criminal, the perpetrator. Only person who has the ability to stop a crime every time. So realize that this exists in our culture, and it is pervasive. We almost always blame the victim first off. We always ask the questions, well, why were they there in the first place? Does it matter? If I throw my wallet on the table with money hanging out, does anyone have a right to my property? No. If I run naked down the street, which I'm not planning to do today, just for your sensibilities, does that give anyone permission to come and touch me? No. So why is it when something bad happens to someone, we blame them for it? Makes no sense. And of course, rape and sexual assault are about power, right? And it's about manifesting power sexually, because it's one of the things that's deeply ingrained in us. So in starting to have conversations about how we manifest sexuality and how we represent ourselves, we start to eliminate the places for those who would wield power over us to hide. Because they can hide behind our culture. They can hide behind making fun of people. They can hide behind making people appear as another, as different from us. Right? People who are non-homosexual or non-heterosexual are assaulted at far greater rates than heterosexual people are. Because they're different in the minds of most people. And therefore, we don't associate harm to them as harm to us. So we need to think about that. I want to cover a couple alternatives. So in terms of societies, there are kind of two different pieces that I wanted to address today, and then we can address more in the future. One is a matriarchal society, and that's where women generally hold the power, and there are examples of those societies that still exist today. And in them, consensual sex with different partners outside of a clearly defined one-pair relationship is common. And it tends to be less of an issue. It tends to just be, hey, would you like to come over and spend the night? Okay, that sounds fun. They also have a more communal idea about raising children, right? Because in a patriarchal society, particularly in the West in the last 500 years, the lineage of the male child is what drove property. So therefore, it was very important to establish legitimacy, and therefore controlling sexual relations was very important. So the alternative of that, when property is more communal in nature, to include the raising of children, those issues tend not to manifest. I find that interesting. That doesn't mean that, today we should immediately convert to another society. Maybe it would work. I'm sure there would be a little bit of pushback. But it's something to consider as a different framework, as an alternative that maybe has good traits that we want to bring into our society in the way we operate. Then there's also polyamory. Now, polyamory is different from polygamy, for those of you who may not be familiar. So polygamy generally is defined as one person marrying a bunch of other people of the opposite sex, right? So this still takes place in Arab countries, right? Where one guy will have many wives. But polyamory is simply having multiple intimate partners with consent of all involved, right? It's pretty straightforward. I know that I have examined this idea philosophically for a long time. It's always been of interest to me. And I have had an open relationship before, and it seemed to work fairly well. What I have found, though, is that culturally most of us are not developed enough, or we're misprogrammed to not be able to operate well in that sort of relationship. Because many of us are programmed with jealousy, with possessiveness. And that's a really difficult thing to overcome. I'll tell you, in my experience with the woman I was dating, this is many years ago, she was actually the first to take advantage of that relationship. And it was my idea. And it still took me like a week to get over the jealousy. But I examined it. I held it out in front of me and said, I am jealous, and I know this is illogical because this was my idea. So I had to sit with it for a while and think about it, and it took me that week to get over. And then I got over it, and it was fine. Now, I've been very fortunate in my life to grow up in sort of a very open philosophical framework. Not a lot of things were forced onto me in terms of beliefs. So I like to think of myself as fairly open-minded, but even for me, just from the tertiary cultural programming I received, it was still difficult to handle. So it's not something that will immediately fix. There's a great video out there of basically like why polyamory won't fix your monogamous marriage, right? There are a lot of philosophical pieces to that. But it is a different way to think about relationships. What if we didn't have to be as rigid in our promises, because basically marriage today promises that you will be with one partner and you will be compatible for the rest of your lives. Maybe that's true. And maybe that's true on different levels. Maybe it's true in the friendship and the compatibility relationship, but maybe it's not true in the sexuality, or maybe vice versa. Maybe you grow in different directions. It's particularly true if you get married really young, right? If you've not even fully developed into an adult. No, I'm not saying that we should abolish the idea of marriage and et cetera, et cetera. I think these are all questions to ask and consider. But this is, again, a different framework to think about. Would this be more advantageous as humanity? Would our society be better or worse? It's hard to say. There are many second, third, fourth, fifth order effects that we'd have to consider. But they are alternatives. So there is no right or wrong answer when it comes to this. The question is the same question we started with in the beginning. How does this make us more adaptive in this time and this circumstance to then advance humanity, to advance our ability to survive and thrive? So why does it matter? One, again, it's one of humanity's biological drivers. It allows for more optionality, right? In accepting and valuing diversity, we have more options going forward. We have people who might fit unique roles better. If we get to the point where we can accept people as people and not as this category of person, it allows us to divert our energy from categorizing and controlling people and then having those people try and defend themselves from control to where we're just focusing on adding value and using people for what they can contribute. And we can counter those who would want to wield power by putting people in categories, us and the other, good and bad. And I think we can do that by normalizing conversation about sex and gender and orientation and just being forthright about the fact that we're all human and it's part of who we are. So with that, thank you all for coming today. We'll have a great conversation afterward, off the record, and we look forward to seeing you next week when we talk about sex part 2, more of the interpersonal relationships, and then how do you talk to your kids about sex. Thanks.